Hi, everyone. Thanks to our previous three speakers and, of course, to Charlotte. So I want to start with a quote. "I would move mountains to work with you and your students." So who comes to mind as the person who might have said this? Perhaps you're thinking about a superstar student like Serena or Ishan, who are in the audience, so I'm going to pick on them. Maybe you're thinking about a super engaged, enthusiastic community partner. Or maybe this is just a quote directly from one of my happiest dreams. It's probably that, right? Surprisingly, the answer is actually none of the things that I mentioned. And today's story revolves around a time when one of my underlying assumptions almost made it the case that I never heard this in real life. Before I get too far ahead of myself, my name is Meenu Singh, and I'm a learning experience designer at the University of Maryland. In my role, I'm tasked with equipping students and faculty from all disciplines with innovation tools and mindsets. So this includes, I teach one course called, it's a highly experiential, often experimental course called Becoming a Design Thinker, Mindsets and Methods for Creativity. And I also work with faculty who are interested in infusing human-centered design into their work. So what does this all mean? So of course, one, it means that I work with I use a lot of Post-it notes, right? Because that's, the kind of thing to use, right? But also it means that a big part of my work is curating learning experiences that allow learners to really apply their design skills to the world around them. So in one class, we made Washington, D.C. our classroom and had a day-long design challenge. In other cases, we might send people around campus, including faculty. We'll make them do things where they're talking to strangers. But it's always about how do you get learners an experience in the real world. So this brings me to my topic. So one of the challenges in the real world that I found really compelling was one that I learned about from my best friend Liz, who was working as a communication partner at a place called Growing Kids Therapy Center in Herndon, Virginia. So here, Liz was working with a group of non-speaking autistic young adults. And what this group, they go ahead and they call themselves Tribe, so T-R-I-B-E. And Tribe is united by two things. One, their friendship, and two, their way of communicating, which, as you can see, is by pointing to letters on a letterboard to spell out their message. One thing I'll also mention is that Tribe is really all about self-advocacy, and so they have that in common as well. So I was really intrigued by this way of communicating, and my first thought was, wouldn't it be so cool to see University of Maryland students designing for non-speaking individuals with autism? So some of you are like, I see where this is going, right? Yeah. So that was my first thought, was really finding a way to collaborate with Tribe in a way that was going to be potentially would allow University of Maryland students to be designers for individuals who are non-speaking who had autism. So I went ahead and I sat in. It was April 2017, and I had my first visit to Tribe. And the scene, it looked something like this. And to describe the scene, I don't have any sound effects, but I will describe this. One young woman was playing, on her phone, playing a song that consisted entirely of cat noises on repeat. At the same time, one young man was being coaxed by Growing Kids Therapy Center's staff out of thrashing about in his chair and also hitting his hands against the wooden table that was in front of him. And though I had somewhat anticipated these behaviors and tics, I admittedly felt really nervous and anxious and really wanted to stay invisible in the room. So I kind of sat in my corner, jotted down notes on what was happening, and really just tried to stay invisible. But what I didn't realize was I actually wasn't invisible and hadn't been invisible the whole time. So amidst the din, Elizabeth Vossler, who runs Growing Kids Therapy Center, kind of announced to the room, "Everyone, we have a guest. Meenu, can you please tell us what you do?" So for all of my design thinking and innovation practitioners in the room, you might share my pain in having to describe to anyone what it is exactly we do, and I've still struggled with that even with my parents after so many years. So here I was, and I felt like I was talking into a void. So so in so few words, I described the human-centered design process, and I'll note that the volume level in the room hadn't decreased, and not a single person was making any sort of eye contact with me. So it's unclear I was unclear if anyone was actually listening to what I was saying. So I went back to my little corner. I sunk back into my chair and kind of anticipated the response. And the members of Tribe began spelling out their responses. And here's what they had to say. So this is the first one. So Ian said, "I don't quite understand your project." And I'll say, like, that was kind of what I expected from having to explain what I do. So I went ahead, I shared another example about design thinking, a project in particular. So I went ahead and elaborated. And this is what Ian said next. "Wow, I love that, Meenu. I think we need more empathy. Empathy starts with gaining understanding." So I kind of went, whoa, this is pretty cool. Not only was I surprised by Ian's eloquence, but I was also surprised at how quickly he was able to grasp one of the core principles of human-centered design from just a quick definition and a small vignette. Here's what the other members of Tribe had to say. So Tom asked, "How can we contribute, Meenu? Designing something for non-speakers would be cool." Paul said, "I would like to understand more about this process." And Ben said, "Meenu, I would move mountains to work with you and your students." So one thing that's really, really cool about all of the things that Tribe had to say is that the members of Tribe are positioning themselves as designers. So remember when I described my work a few minutes earlier, really the underlying premise of my work is that anyone can learn how to be a creative problem solver. And yet I had come into this collaboration with totally discrediting the potential abilities of a whole group of learners. I realized I'd overlooked the possibility that that group in the room with me could be and wanted to be the ones designing, not just being the ones who would be designed for. So baked into my initial idea for collaboration, I had discounted the creative potential of an entire group. So it really was the case that my assumption was I did not believe that a group of non-speaking individuals with autism could be innovators. So I realized that I needed to challenge myself and test my assumptions just as I teach my students. And in that moment, I reframed my initial challenge from how might we have University of Maryland students design for non-speaking autistics to the new question, how might we equip non-speaking autistics with the tools of design thinking? So the Growing Kids team was thrilled by this reframe, and I was invited to lead Tribe through a 3-day design thinking workshop over the summer. Then it was time to get to work. So my co-conspirator, who's here with us, Serena, can you wave? Serena, who's a senior at the University of Maryland, just trying to make her blush as much as possible. Serena and I wanted to build a design thinking workshop that would not only push the accessibility of the tools, but also our process for designing learning experiences. So first of all, informed by my previous oversight, like big oversight, not just a little one, I wanted to start out by tackling my insecurities and assumptions head on. So for example, these were some of the questions that Serena and I had. What does interviewing for empathy look like when a designer can't speak? How does a group conduct a creative brainstorm without writing on Post-its? Like, that must be impossible. That said, like, half facetiously, but also I was like, but, you know, really, like, that seems like kind of wild. How does rapid prototyping work when building something fast is potentially inhibited by a brain-body, what's called the brain-body disconnect? So what we did, we went ahead and we sketched out storyboards of our workshop to both create a flow and also identify how we might modify our tools to support our learners. As another example, Serena and I weren't sure if Tribe preferred people-first language, as I had been taught, so individuals with autism, or just autistics. And so what we did was, instead of running with our assumptions, we just asked. And it turns out that Tribe prefers autistics instead of people with autism, which is why I've been using that phrase through this talk so far. To continue gaining empathy for our learners, so we took lots of notes and calls with our community partners and talking with Tribe. But to continue gaining empathy for our learners, Serena and I communicated solely using letterboards during some of our planning sessions, which helped us get a sense of the pace of communication as for both sending and receiving the messages. Then came the workshop itself. We launched into a design challenge focused on redesigning the introduction experience for one another. Tribe started out by conducting interviews for empathy using their letterboards. And by the end of the process, they came up with thoughtful innovations for each other. For example, so this is Ian and Ben, but I want to kind of show the list. So this is kind of what was generated, some of the solutions. I want to point out two in particular. So Emma designed for Tom and designed an empathy hat that would allow others to experience the brain-body disconnect that Tom experiences to better understand the real Tom. In turn, for Emma, Tom designed noise-canceling headphones that allow people to hear Emma's true words even when she needs to scream. So, pretty awesome stuff. So of course, these were ideas, pen on paper, and if the next step in the process is to bring it up a resolution. So we got to building things. So we invited Tribe to our design studio at the University of Maryland, and we got to work at bringing those ideas to life. So remember, I had the question earlier of how Tribe would rapidly prototype. Well, they may not have done it rapidly, but by working with their communication partners, they were able to give step-by-step instructions on how to manipulate each piece of aluminum foil, each pipe cleaner, each prototyping material to ultimately build and then test their solutions and get feedback from one another. So to wrap up the workshop, I asked Tribe how they might use all or parts of the design thinking process in the future. Here are two things they said. So Ian said, and I quote, "I want to use design thinking in how I approach challenges." Tom said, "Design thinking will include others in our experience." Emma said, I want to challenge educators to use design thinking to include autistics." It's clear that Tribe learned a lot from the experience, but they weren't the only ones. I walked away with a deeper, more fundamental understanding of the design thinking process. I gained more trust and patience with my learners. And most importantly, I gained a new perspective on the question, who gets to be a designer? As a design educator, it was painful to acknowledge that I had implicitly excluded a group from learning. Now, going forward, the question isn't necessarily how do we design for other groups? It's how do we adapt, modify, retool the processes and tools of innovation to seek out and empower new tribes of designers? And what do we stand to gain by doing so? So at the beginning, I showed that quote, so spoiler alert, so is Ben, right? And Ben said he would move mountains to work with me and my students. And my question is, what new peaks can we reach when we scale those mountains together?